UMass professor Michael Morgan is in studio with us today. He may be responsible, Lewis, for this show even existing. And
it's my fault?
We can say it in a way because I heard about the original radio station where the show started doing an internship that you sponsored me for. So we're here to talk about Mean World Syndrome, a documentary by Media Education Foundation, and the film is available at mediaed.org for institutions. You can also contact MEF through the website for personal copies to set up a screening in your community. There's been a lot of debate over the years about whether watching violent movies or playing violent video games, something Lewis knows a lot about, actually makes people more violent. And at face value, I used to kind of think that was logical, but more research says that's not really the result. Is that right?
Well, yes and no. That has been the question that has dominated the field since the 1950s and before. I mean, it started in the 20s with movies, and then with comic books, and then with television from the 50s onward. And it's the wrong question. It's the simple question. It's the obvious question. And the way the whole thing works is if the networks can get people to focus on that question, then they're going to continually find that, no, for the most part, it doesn't. Maybe some people once in a while, but that's not the most common effect of violence. But the public is obsessed with it. Congress is obsessed with it. The whole world is obsessed with it. And then George Gerbner came along in the 60s and started thinking about things a little differently. And he said he noticed from the content analyses he was doing of television violence that there are a lot more people on television that are victims of violence than perpetrate it. A lot more people suffer violence than initiate it. And he started to think, well, gee, if everybody's so concerned about television, people imitating what they see, maybe they're more likely to identify with the victims. And think about it. I mean, there are 5 or 6 acts of violence on television every single hour.
And what does that mean? On one channel or in one show?
In network television, on the average per hour.
So ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox.
And other major similar cable channels.
Right.
You've got 5 or 6 acts of violence per hour. You've got 70% of all characters each week involved in violence. If imitation was going to be the most likely consequence, we wouldn't need to do research. We'd all be dead. You know, everybody doesn't respond to what they see by going and shooting and killing their neighbors.
Right.
But what Gerbner reasoned and what the data then showed was that people who spend more time watching television are not going to be more violent. They're going to be more afraid. They're going to be more mistrustful. They're going to be more apprehensive of other people. They're more concerned about violence being done to them. So it turns the whole debate on its head. It's a much more pervasive effect.
So then the argument could be made, well, so people will just be more cautious, right? When they're out and about because they've seen these things that happen on TV, they'll just look around a little bit more. Is it that bad?
Well, it's an exaggeration. It's an overstimulation of fear. It's beyond being a little more cautious. It's being very mistrustful. It's buying a lot more guns. It's locking your doors beyond the level that's needed. And it leads to a sense of insecurity and apprehension that justifies the suspension of civil liberties if it's going to give people security.
Overall, we may be more accepting of the way that we have to be searched or what's legal in terms of surveillance or whatever.
Exactly.
Because we believe the world to be a more dangerous place, in part because of what we're seeing on TV.
It contributes to that sense of a mean and dangerous world.
What are other factors? Because I'm sure some of our audience will say, well, that's fine. I watched a couple movies and they make me think that crazy rapes are committed more regularly than they are. But that's not really why I think it's okay for us to have the nude body scanners or whatever at the airports.
Well, the media do not act in isolation from the rest of the culture. Media takes certain cultural tendencies, certain values, certain positions, and they amplify them, they share them, they strengthen them, they cultivate them.
Why is the decision being made by these networks, for example, which we're looking at, to put 6 instances of violence an hour? Is it because they believe that is what people are entertained by? Is it because it's profitable?
It's highly profitable, especially on the international market. Most of the money from television programs comes from syndication, and a lot of that is international. If you have comedy, that doesn't travel well to other countries. Jokes are culture specific. But violence is very cheap, it's very formulaic, and it's understood across the world very, very easily. So because it's easy then to syndicate and sell to other countries, that's why there's so much of it.
So for the individual successes of shows like The Simpsons or Seinfeld overseas, we can probably find, 5 or 10 series, the different Law and Orders, so on and so forth. which translate in a much more straightforward way to other audiences.
It's much cheaper to export violence.
We thought some of the increased gun sales were because Barack Obama is going to take away your guns, and if a Democratic president is elected, all of the rules will change. Assault weapons, let's get them now.
Well, it's not either or. They're not exclusive.
So we may have another factor here, which is that people are more likely to believe they need to have guns separate from whatever political forces might or might not let them have them. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it all feeds into all kinds of other aspects of representation, because they're not just afraid in the abstract. They're afraid of specific types of people that are shown as violent over and over. There is no group on television that is more violent than Latinos. And the Hispanic Americans are shown as consistently violent, and that's why you have all this discourse about the drug dealers, about the illegal immigrants, this ranting nonstop mantra about illegal immigration. It's also fear of specific types of people.
Is the effect of these video games and movies more significant on children than it is on adults?
We haven't found that. We've found that it's pretty stable across the board. We don't study young children. Other research does that because they don't quite have the skills needed to participate in our research. But we've studied young adolescents and over and haven't found any particular differences.
We're speaking with University of Massachusetts Professor Michael Morgan. The documentary is called Mean World Syndrome, and you can find out more at mediaed.org. I was thinking, during high school and elementary school, Lewis was very, very into the violent video games and the gory movies. And I mean, at one point, if you ask Lewis...
I still am.
But at one point, Lewis was really seen by many of our classmates as kind of a dark guy. He might list death as a hobby, for example. So Lewis, in a sense here, has never really tended to be a violent guy. And something has kind of changed over the last few years with Lewis, where I don't know if maybe he's gotten more into politics and his progressive side is making him have a little more empathy.
There's plenty of people that will commit violence that will never watch violence in the media. Plenty of people like Lewis that will watch the worst stuff, and he looks like a pretty gentle guy most of the time.
He's relatively well-adjusted.
But it's not that kind of monkey see, monkey do. It's not that kind of direct stimulus response relationship we're talking about.
But I guess my question is, what other forces can we identify that would act as mitigating factors to make people okay with just, the world is not out there to get me? What else can we point to? Because you're right. If you just are a fan of these TV shows and basically mainstream news, you could get the impression that that's just all that there is. I mean, what is it? Family relationships? Is it other types of movies? Is it reading? I mean...
Actually, it's a very interesting question because people usually ask, what are the other sources of fear? What are the other sources of anxiety? People have not really asked what might mitigate it. And it's hard to know because we don't find a lot of factors that will reduce vulnerability. In fact, what we find, if you look, for example, at groups defined by education, you look at the less educated and you look at the more educated, you might find that the people with less education are a lot more fearful, a lot more apprehensive, a lot more mistrustful in general, regardless of television viewing. They're just up higher on that scale. And if you look at people that are more educated, if they don't watch a lot of television, they're not as fearful, mistrustful, apprehensive.
Is there any way to completely shield someone from whatever age you have to start doing it and have them not be exposed to this media landscape that exists?
Only if you don't let them out of the house and keep them locked in a room, because even if they're not watching, they're living in a culture where everybody else, their lives are dominated by media. So what you don't get directly, you get indirectly through social interaction.
Fans of a lot of the programs that come to mind, Law and Order, SVU is an example that comes to mind to me, would say, well, it's a show about sexual crimes that are committed in New York City. So whenever you tune in, naturally, you're going to see sexual crimes that have been committed in New York City. Should that show not be on the air? Should it be on the... So my question is, how can we have the entertaining programming that people want, but not have to have this culture of fear be created?
It's not a question of individual programs. It's not a question of individuals. It's a question of the system and the institutions that we've created. There's always been violence in stories. There's violence in Shakespeare. There's violence in the Bible. There's violence in every legend and fairy tale you can come up with. What's different now is the fact, not that there's violence in the stories, but we've never had so much exposure to so much violence as there is now. And storytelling has been taken over by a small handful of commercial corporations. So it's not that there are violent stories out there. It's that storytelling has been dominated by a small number of corporations, conglomerates, and that because we don't enforce antitrust laws, media ownership has gotten more and more concentrated. So it's not a question of having fewer violent stories. It's allowing more people to tell stories.
So regardless of the media consolidation or not, if those are the stories that are most profitable, even if there were more players in the market, wouldn't they also want to tell the same stories?
No, because it doesn't always have to be driven by a market orientation. In most of the rest of the world, the media were not developed to be supported by commercial private advertising. Media were a scarce public resource. You support public schools, you support public libraries, you support public parks. Media were seen as serving a public service function just like that. But we can't conceive of media other than supported by advertising.
But I guess what I'm saying is, let's say we did, and there were more choices that didn't involve violence. If the ones that are most interesting are still the ones that do,
no, they're not always the most interesting. A lot of the times, violent programs have lower ratings, but they're cheap to produce. They are cheap to produce.
There's no indication that the only things that will do well are these types of programs.
Not at all.
It's that there's been a certain conditioning that is what is on prime time on the channels that most people have. And therefore, that's what's going to be produced.
And the most popular programs are rarely violent. American Idol or something like that. Oh, it's violent in a different way. But these are not usually the top-rated programs. It's a question of not that they're seen more than anything else, but that they dominate the symbolic environment in their numbers.
And we've been talking mostly about fiction programs, but what about on the news side? I mean, obviously there's a selection of if you have an hour newscast and you take away 12 minutes for commercials, you've got 48 minutes to pick from. What is the thought process that's leading to more violent stories there?
Well, especially in the terms of local news. I mean, that is where it's seen that it does the best job of gripping and really
the
grabbing.
Murder down the street.
The murder, the fires. I mean, the fire, the murder, the rape, the disappearance. That's local news is dominated by that. But interestingly, there have been a number of studies that have shown very clearly that the amount of violence in local news in a community is not related to the amount of violence in that community. And the levels of fear and mistrust and apprehension in that community are related more to the news than to the actual amount of violence. So it's not this notion, well, the violence is out there, the news is just reflecting it. No, it's done purely as a way to attract audiences to grab them, because local news is the most profitable local programming for local stations.
So is it in a sense, if you talk about, especially in local newscasts, where maybe the entire newscast is 19 minutes or 21 minutes or something like that, if there is one murder or if there are 5, presumably it's going to take up the same portion of that broadcast, right? We know weather is very popular in local news. You've probably got 7 minutes there, and then you've got a couple minutes about just local events or something school-related. I can see where, regardless of how many murders there are, it would command about the same amount of every broadcast. And is that where the disproportion is coming from?
Yeah, I think it's more that in some areas it's seen if they're more competitive, for example, or they're seeing their audience ratings decline. They will be told to inject more fires, murders, rapes, etc., because they do get viewers excited, especially when you have the little teaser ahead of time. Find out what neighborhood someone was just raped in today. And, oh my God, is it mine?
The last thing I kind of want to talk about is we talked about more gun purchases as a result of this kind of culture of fear that is being created. What other specific consequences are there?
Well, we did not do a study for this most recent Iraq war, but we did one for the one before. And it was very, very striking. We found that people who watched more television, more news, and more drama and more entertainment, they were more in support of the war against Saddam Hussein. And they also, the more they watched, the less they knew. So they had less understanding of what the issues were, and they believed more of the propaganda.
And when you say the more they watched fiction programming or just news?
Both, across the board.
So people watched more regular news, and they actually had more misconceptions about the war.
And more likely to see violence as a justifiable tool to solve problems.
Well, the documentary is Mean World Syndrome. I highly recommend it. It's by the Media Education Foundation. You can get the film at mediaed.org. Now, if you also want to get it to set up a screening or just a personal copy, you can contact MEF at 800-897-0089.